In a galaxy where power is defined by wealth and status, a humble janitor, Elias, is nothing more than a shadow beneath the grandeur of the alien empire. But when he steps into the presence of a queen, everything he's ever known about his place in the universe begins to unravel. Little does he know, this seemingly insignificant man holds the key to a long-forgotten legacy, one that will alter the galaxy forever. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if you're hooked by stories like this, be sure to hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode will leave you on the edge of your seat. The corridors of the alien citadel were vast and cold, their walls made of glimmering glass and black stone, like a monument to the arrogance of the empire. Beneath the towering structures, hidden from the glances of delegates and nobles, Elias Ward worked tirelessly, a human janitor in a world that had long forgotten his kind. His faded navy jumpsuit was stained with grime, the fabric stretched thin from years of wear. He moved silently, a ghost, sweeping the endless floors of the Hall of Convergence, his hands rough from the chemicals and the constant motion. Elias didn't mind. He'd grown accustomed to the quiet hum of machines, to the lack of acknowledgement from the creatures that filled the grand chambers. They passed him by without a second glance, their jeweled robes and alien features far too regal to notice the man who cleaned their paths. It had always been this way, ever since he had arrived on Threxion, cast away like a speck of dust in a world that did not care for humans. His job was simple: scrub the floors, clean the tables, and make sure the grand halls shone like mirrors of authority. But today, something was different. As Elias pushed his mop across the polished obsidian, a soft sound caught his ear. Footsteps that didn't belong to the usual throngs of delegates. The sound echoed in the vast hall, the air growing still with a tension he couldn't quite place. He continued his work, focusing on the task at hand, though his mind remained alert. It was then that she appeared. The doors to the Hall of Judgment opened with a resounding crack, and all eyes turned to her. The Queen of Threxion, tall as the storms that raged across the skies of her homeworld, stepped into the room. Her carapace shimmered with 100 shifting colors, reflecting the molten rivers of light running through the ceiling above. Her crystal crown pulsed with a rhythm older than the stars themselves. The very air seemed to bend around her, as though the universe itself was holding its breath in her presence. Elias did not look up. He continued to sweep the floor, his movements slow and deliberate. He had seen queens before, their faces cold and their eyes filled with disdain for his kind. He knew better than to hope for anything more than their fleeting attention. Yet, something about this queen was different. Her presence wasn't just powerful, it was deeply unsettling. The chamber held its breath, waiting for her command. The queen's gaze swept the room, her eyes narrowing as they passed over the figures seated in judgment, the nobles who held the fates of countless worlds in their hands. And then, they landed on Elias. For a moment, the world seemed to freeze. The queen did not speak, she did not move. Her gaze lingered on him, an intensity in her eyes that made Elias feel exposed, as though she could see through the layers of his uniform, through the dust and grime, and into the very heart of who he was. Elias didn't flinch. He kept his head down, focused on the mop in his hand, as though nothing had changed. But inside, his heart beat faster. There was something about her, something he couldn't quite understand. The room buzzed with whispers, but Elias remained silent, his reflection faintly visible in the polished stone beneath his feet. The queen stepped forward, her cloak sweeping across the floor like a shadow, and for the first time in his life, Elias felt the weight of an entire empire pressing down on him. The hall was silent, a heavy tension in the air as the queen stood at the edge of the great chamber. Her gaze never wavered from Elias, studying him with an intensity that unnerved even the most seasoned delegates. The space seemed to pause in her presence, the very walls holding their breath. Elias, unmoving, kept his focus on the floor, his mop handle gripped firmly. His heart raced, but his outward calm remained unbroken. The queen's eyes were deep pools, dark and piercing, and for the first time in his life, Elias felt the weight of her scrutiny, like she was searching for something hidden beneath the surface. After a long moment, she spoke, her voice low and commanding. "Why do you do this?" Elias didn't lift his gaze. His answer came from instinct, quiet and resigned. "It's my job." The Queen's expression softened ever so slightly. She didn't answer right away, but her eyes lingered, considering his words. "You clean what others will never notice, what they will never appreciate." He didn't respond. There was no need. It was the same answer he had given countless times before: his job, his duty, to be invisible. The Queen took a slow step forward, her regal presence filling the room. "Perhaps," she said, almost to herself, "there's more to you than I thought." Elias remained still, the weight of her words settling in his chest. He had never expected her to speak to him, let alone with such intrigue. But in her eyes, he could feel the beginning of something that would change everything. She saw him, truly saw him, in a way no one else ever had. The Queen didn't linger long. She turned, her cloak trailing behind her like a dark storm cloud. But as she moved, Elias felt the unmistakable shift in the air, like the entire empire was holding its breath, waiting for the Queen to pass judgment. Days passed, and the world around Elias remained unchanged. The grand hall continued to echo with the sounds of alien voices, the laughter of delegates, and the constant hum of a powerful empire. Elias, the janitor, was invisible once more, a fixture in the background, swept away by the tide of authority and wealth that flowed through the citadel. He scrubbed the floors, cleaned the tables, and repaired the broken pieces of a universe that didn't know his name. But something had shifted within him. The Queen's gaze still lingered in his mind, a quiet storm that refused to be forgotten. He couldn't explain why her attention had felt so different, so personal. Why, after all these years of anonymity, had she chosen to look at him? It was late one evening when it happened again. Elias was scrubbing the marble floors as usual, his motions mechanical. He had just dipped the mop into the bucket when he heard soft footsteps approaching. It wasn't the usual sound of guards or delegates. These steps were slower, more deliberate. Elias didn't look up, assuming it was just another aristocrat passing by. But then, a voice, soft yet clear, broke through the ambient noise. "You're not like the others." Elias froze, his mop halfway to the floor. He didn't have to look to know who it was. The voice was unmistakable. The Queen. She was standing just beyond his line of sight, her presence towering above him like a distant storm. He didn't know why she was here, why she was speaking to him again, but there she was, watching him with that same curiosity that had unsettled him before. He finally lifted his head, locking eyes with her for the first time since their initial encounter. "I'm just cleaning," Elias said, his voice steady, though his heart raced. The Queen tilted her head slightly, as though trying to understand. "There's something different about you." Her words were almost a whisper, as if she were speaking to herself. Elias didn't answer. He wasn't sure what to say. He was just a janitor, nothing more. Yet, for some reason, the Queen believed there was more to him. She stood there for a moment longer, studying him with an intensity that made Elias feel exposed. And then, without another word, she turned and walked away, her cloak sweeping the floor like a shadow in motion. Elias watched her go, his mind racing. He didn't know what it was, but something had changed. Something inside him felt different. For the first time, the weight of his insignificance felt a little lighter. The days that followed were uneventful, as days often were in the sprawling alien citadel. Delegates came and went, their voices an endless hum of politics and trade, while Elias continued his work in silence. He had grown accustomed to being overlooked, to fading into the shadows as the galaxy's most powerful walked around him. But something had shifted since the Queen's gaze had fallen upon him, and that change, unseen by everyone but him, was growing. It was during his evening shift that it came. A task unlike any other. The large curved doors to the Hall of Judgment opened, and a group of high-ranking delegates entered. Their chatter was a mixture of languages and dialects, flowing over each other like a wave. They spoke in the alien tongue of the Vayari, but Elias had learned bits and pieces during his years in the citadel. One word caught his attention: inspection. His heart skipped a beat. The Hall of Judgment was a sacred place, reserved for the most important matters in the Empire. This was where decisions were made, where history was written. And now, it was being inspected. The group of delegates settled, their presence filling the room with a cold, authoritative energy. A few glanced down at Elias, but their gazes were fleeting, dismissive. He focused on his task, mopping the floor beneath their feet. As Elias moved toward the far corner of the hall, the Queen's voice interrupted the quiet hum of activity. "He will clean this section last," she said, her words echoing through the chamber. Her tone was firm, but there was something else in it, something deeper, like a command wrapped in a challenge. The delegates shifted uncomfortably, their eyes flicking to the Queen. No one spoke. They had long since grown used to her unpredictable nature, but this was different. Her voice had a sharpness to it, a clarity that suggested there was more at play than a simple request. Elias hesitated for a moment. Why had she singled out this part of the hall? And why now, when the room was filled with such important figures? But he didn't question her command. He simply nodded and moved toward the section she had indicated, his mop swishing against the marble floor. The delegates, still observing, leaned in as Elias began his task. The pressure of their eyes on him was almost tangible. The Queen watched from her distant throne, her expression unreadable. Elias scrubbed with purpose, each stroke deliberate and steady. It wasn't just about cleaning, it was about something more, something he couldn't quite explain. He worked with a quiet intensity, as though his actions might prove something he had never had the chance to show. The room held its breath, waiting for him to finish. Elias finished his task, the marble floor now gleaming under the soft light of the chamber. But there was no sense of relief, no satisfaction from the usual work. This time, something felt different, something had shifted in the very air. The Queen had watched him closely, and so had the delegates, their eyes filled with an unspoken challenge. The room was still, as though waiting for the next moment to unfold. When he was done, the Queen's voice broke the silence once more. "Bring him here." The words were simple, yet they carried weight. Elias glanced toward the throne where she stood, her gaze unwavering. He wiped his hands on his jumpsuit before stepping forward, each step echoing in the vast hall. The floor beneath him felt colder now, as though the space itself had grown heavier with the presence of power. As he approached the center of the room, the delegates whispered among themselves, their voices barely a murmur, yet it felt like a storm swirling around him. There was a quiet tension in the air, an expectation that Elias couldn't ignore. The Queen's eyes were fixed on him, but they weren't filled with the usual disdain he had come to expect from the elite of the Empire. No, this time they seemed curious, almost expectant. "Elias Ward," the Queen said, her voice cutting through the stillness like a blade. "You have been a servant here, unnoticed by most, but today you will be more than that. You will face a trial." A murmur rippled through the delegates. Elias stood still, his heart beating faster than usual. "A trial? For a janitor? I will not subject you to the humiliations the others expect," she continued. "This is a different kind of trial, one that will test your mind, your worth, not as a servant, but as something more." The crowd quieted, all eyes now on Elias. The delegates seemed divided, some curious, others skeptical. But Elias had no time to dwell on their expressions. He had already spent too long learning to fade into the background. Now, the Queen had placed him in the spotlight. The Queen nodded to an assistant who stepped forward with a glowing orb. It hovered just above the ground, pulsing with an ethereal light. The orb's surface rippled like liquid, its patterns constantly shifting. "This," the Queen said, her tone growing somber, "is a test of perception, of memory. You will solve what has been lost. Only then will you prove your worth." Elias's stomach twisted. He had never been asked to prove himself before, but as the orb glowed in front of him, he realized this wasn't about cleaning floors anymore. This was about something deeper, something that could change everything. The trial had begun. Elias stood before the glowing orb, its rippling surface pulling at something deep within him. The delegates were silent, their collective gaze fixated on him, waiting for him to make a move. The air in the hall felt thick, oppressive, as though the weight of their expectations was bearing down on him from every direction. The Queen's eyes, dark as the void, watched him with an intensity that made it impossible to ignore her presence, but she said nothing. She simply waited, like a storm holding its breath, Elias didn't know what this trial was about or what he was supposed to do, but he had learned to trust his instincts. For all the years he had spent invisible, mopping floors and cleaning halls, he had developed an awareness, a sensitivity to patterns, to the subtle things that others overlooked. The orb's surface shimmered again, its patterns shifting and swirling like a tide of liquid stars. It felt familiar, almost like something he had seen before. His hands, still warm from the mop, twitched, and without thinking, he stepped closer to the orb. The moment his fingers brushed the surface, something inside the orb clicked. The shifting patterns slowed, aligning themselves in a way that seemed to mirror the intricate designs he had traced into the marble floors of the Hall of Convergence. The room held its breath. The delegates leaned forward, their eyes wide with surprise. The orb pulsed once, then twice, as if acknowledging something hidden in Elias's touch. The Queen's gaze never wavered, but there was something in her eyes now, something that had not been there before. The faintest flicker of recognition. Elias didn't look up, didn't acknowledge the stunned silence around him. He didn't need to. His mind was focused on the patterns, the subtle intersections of lines, the way the shapes connected. The symbols on the orb were old, forgotten by most, but to him they were familiar, like memories from another life. The orb continued to glow, the patterns folding into themselves, revealing a shape that was both ancient and new. It was a constellation, a map of the stars, but one that no longer existed, a forgotten language of light. The crowd stirred, gasping in disbelief. Elias had done it. Without a word, without any grand display, he had solved the puzzle. The trial was over. The Queen's voice broke the silence. "You have proven your worth," she said, her tone both measured and heavy with meaning. Not through strength, not through power, but through quiet observation, through memory. Elias looked up then, meeting her gaze. For the first time since he had arrived on Threxion, he felt seen not just as a servant, not just as a janitor, but as something more. The delegates were stunned into silence, unsure of how to react. Some were still trying to process what had just happened, while others exchanged uncertain glances. The trial was meant to expose weakness, to humiliate. Instead, Elias had turned it into a silent victory. The Queen nodded once, the barest hint of approval in her expression. "You are not what you appear, Elias Ward," she said softly. "There is more to you than even you know." Elias stood tall, but his heart remained calm. The room may have been in shock, but for him, this was just another quiet moment of clarity. The hall buzzed with uncertainty. Elias stood motionless in the center of the room, his fingers still tingling from the orb's touch. He could feel the weight of the room's gaze pressing on him from all sides, yet he remained unmoved, as if the world around him had become nothing more than a faint echo. The delegates exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what they had just witnessed. The quiet janitor had done the unthinkable. He had passed a trial designed to break him, and not just any trial. This one was meant for the elite, the powerful, the ones who held the galaxy in their grasp. But Elias had won, silently, undeniably. The Queen, her posture regal as ever, stood at the edge of the room, her gaze steady. It was as if she, too, was measuring the shift in the air, calculating what this small, seemingly insignificant human had just done. A faint glimmer of respect flickered in her violet eyes, but her expression remained neutral. She said nothing, yet the weight of her presence seemed to carry more significance now than ever before. The delegates began to stir, slowly at first, as though unsure whether they should applaud or protest. Their whispers grew louder, a wave of confusion crashing through the chamber. The power dynamics of the room had subtly shifted, and they weren't sure how to respond. Elias could feel the change, too. It wasn't immediate, but the energy around him had changed. The usual disdain and dismissive glances had been replaced with something else, a quiet wariness. He wasn't just the janitor anymore. He had become something else, something the Empire's elite hadn't anticipated, a person to be reckoned with, even if they didn't fully understand why. The Queen finally spoke, her voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd. "This trial was never about your physical strength, Elias Ward," she said, her tone measured, yet layered with meaning. "It was about understanding what others have long forgotten. You have proven that you see beyond the surface." Elias didn't answer. He didn't need to. The truth of the moment was enough. He had never been here to prove himself to anyone. But the Queen, she had seen something in him that no one else had. And now, he could feel the shifting tides of power, slowly turning in his favor. The delegates shifted uneasily, their gazes flicking from Elias to the Queen and back again. Some of the more ambitious ones, those who had once laughed at the thought of a human being anything more than a servant, were starting to see the implications of what had just transpired. One by one, they began to stand, their expressions hardening with resolve. They would not let this moment pass unnoticed. They would not let a janitor, no matter what he had proven, dare to shift the order of things. But Elias, still standing in the center of the room, didn't flinch. He had no words for them. He had never needed them. The Queen had spoken, and in this place, that was all that mattered. The room quieted, the delegates now reluctant to engage in the game of power they had once dominated. The balance had shifted, and Elias, for the first time in his life, felt it. The power wasn't just in the hands of the elite anymore. It was in the air, moving silently, subtly, and it was his to navigate. The days that followed were filled with uncertainty, the kind that crackled in the air like static. Elias could feel it, the way the corridors felt colder now, the way the eyes of the delegates lingered a moment longer than they should. The Queen had acknowledged his worth, but that recognition came with a price. There was no turning back now. The trial he had passed, the trial that had shaken the very foundations of the Empire's power, was only the beginning. The Queen, though seemingly detached, had made her intentions clear. She saw something in him, something that others had overlooked for so long. But now, the stakes were higher. Elias stood in the Hall of Convergence once again, his mop in hand, as the hum of conversation filled the air. Today was different. The hall was more crowded than usual. The delegates gathered in tight clusters, speaking in hushed voices. Something was about to happen. The Queen's presence was felt before she even entered the room. When the doors to the chamber opened, it was as if the room held its collective breath. She walked in with the same imposing grace, her eyes scanning the room before landing on Elias. There was no time for pleasantries, no room for hesitation. "Elias Ward," she said, her voice commanding attention, "you have proven yourself capable in ways no one expected. But now, I need you to show me something else." Elias didn't speak. He only nodded, his heart beating a little faster in his chest. He didn't know what she wanted from him, but the weight of her words carried a deep significance. This wasn't about sweeping floors or solving puzzles anymore. This was something more personal, something that could affect the very future of the Empire. The Queen's gaze softened, just a fraction, and she motioned for one of the guards to step forward. The guard carried a small, intricately carved box, placing it gently at Elias's feet. It was a strange object, covered in ancient symbols that Elias didn't recognize. It pulsed with a faint, eerie glow, as if it were alive. "This box," the Queen began, "contains a secret that could change everything. But to open it, you must prove your worth once more, not with your mind, but with your heart." Elias looked down at the box, the weight of the task sinking in. There was something ancient about it, something that carried the weight of 1,000 untold stories. The room fell silent, the delegates watching with rapt attention. The Queen's voice broke through his thoughts. "Open it, Elias, and show us what you're capable of." For the first time, Elias felt a twinge of doubt. What could he possibly know about this secret? What could he offer in the face of something so profound? But he knew, deep down, that this was his moment. This was his true test. Taking a steady breath, he reached down and opened the box. The moment Elias opened the box, the room seemed to hold its breath. A soft, golden light spilled from within, illuminating the faces of the delegates as they leaned in, eager for what would come next. The glow pulsed with a rhythm of its own, steady and gentle, yet there was an undeniable power in it, a presence that made the air thick with anticipation. Elias reached inside, his fingers brushing against the smooth, cool surface of what appeared to be an ancient artifact, a small, intricately carved key. It was unlike anything he had ever seen, the symbols etched into its surface both foreign and familiar, as though it had existed long before the empire itself. He held it up for the room to see, his grip firm but steady. The key gleamed in the light, its intricate design shifting with the movement of the crowd. A murmur rippled through the delegates, their whispers like a wave crashing against the shore. The queen, who had watched with an intensity that could rival the cosmos, took a step forward, her gaze fixed on the key in Elias's hand. Her eyes, once filled with curiosity, now held something deeper: recognition. It was as though she understood, in that very moment, the weight of what Elias had just uncovered. Elias felt a strange, heavy weight in his chest. He had never seen this key before, yet something about it felt right. It was as if it belonged to him, as if it had always been meant for his hand to hold. "Do you understand what you have found?" The queen's voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried through the hall like a thunderclap. There was no judgment in her words, only a quiet acknowledgement of what had transpired. Elias didn't answer immediately. He wasn't sure he had the words to explain the sensation that was rising within him, the pull of something ancient and forgotten. It was more than just the key. It was what it represented, what it could unlock. The queen stepped closer, her crystal crown pulsing faintly with the same light as the key. "This is the Meridian Key," she said, her voice tinged with reverence. "It was lost to time, buried beneath the weight of 1,000 empires, but you, Elias Ward, have found it. And with it, you can unlock what was once sealed away, truths long buried, powers that even the gods of this galaxy dare not touch." The room fell silent. The weight of her words hung in the air like a veil, thick with meaning. The delegates shifted uneasily, their expressions filled with awe and suspicion. The Meridian Key was more than just a relic. It was a symbol of power, a key to untold secrets that could change the course of the galaxy. Elias's heart pounded in his chest. This was it, the moment when everything could change. He had found the key, but what did it mean for him? For the galaxy? What truths lay locked behind its secrets? The queen looked at him, her expression unreadable. "The choice is yours, Elias. Will you unlock the past, or let it remain forgotten?" Elias stood still, the weight of the key heavy in his hand. The power to shape the future was within his grasp. But with it came a burden, a responsibility he had never asked for. The decision would change everything, and for the first time, Elias didn't feel like the invisible janitor. He felt like a man who could change the course of history. Elias stood in the center of the hall, the Meridian Key now weighing heavily in his hand, its golden light reflecting off the polished marble floor. The room, once filled with murmurs and whispers, was now silent, as though the very air was waiting for him to speak. The queen's presence was like a steady pulse, ever present but never demanding, and the delegates, who had once looked at him as a mere servant, were now waiting for him to make a choice. The decision was his. The power that had been hidden for eons lay before him, like a door he could open or leave closed forever. "You have proven yourself." The queen's voice echoed through the hall, soft but powerful, not by strength or glory, but by understanding what others have long forgotten. "You found the Meridian Key, Elias Ward, but what will you do with it?" Elias's fingers tightened around the key, feeling its cool surface beneath his skin. The weight of the decision seemed to anchor him to the floor, as though he could feel the burden of history pressing down on his shoulders. He had never sought power. He had never wanted recognition. His life had always been about cleaning up, staying unnoticed, and fading into the background. But now, fate had thrust him into the light, and he could no longer avoid it. "I don't know," Elias said softly, his voice breaking the stillness. The words came without force, but with an honesty that felt raw. "I never asked for any of this." The queen regarded him with those same piercing eyes, as though she could see deep into his soul. She didn't speak immediately, but her gaze softened, a quiet acknowledgement of the internal struggle Elias was facing. "You may not have asked for it," she said at last, "but you have been chosen, not by fate, but by your actions, by your quiet persistence in the face of everything that would make you invisible." Elias's thoughts swirled in a dizzying storm. The key in his hand, the powers it could unlock, the truths that could shatter empires, all of it was more than he had ever imagined. And yet, at the core of it, he still felt like the same man who had walked these halls, unnoticed and unseen. How could he, a janitor, wield such power? The delegates were still, their gazes locked on him. For the first time, Elias felt their scrutiny, but it was no longer laced with mockery or dismissal. It was laced with something else, something closer to respect. The Queen had given him a choice, but it was more than that. She had given him a chance to reshape the world, not with violence or grand gestures, but with the quiet authority of someone who understood the value of the smallest things, the things everyone else overlooked. Elias lifted his gaze and looked around the hall. He saw the faces of the delegates, the alien nobility, and the Queen. They had expected him to take the key, to wield it as a weapon, but Elias knew better. The key was not meant to dominate. It was meant to unlock, to reveal truths long buried, to bring change, not through force but through understanding. "I won't open it," Elias said, his voice steady. "Not yet. Not until we are ready to hear what it has to say." The Queen's eyes glinted with something like pride, but there was no judgment in her expression. She nodded slowly, as though she understood the weight of his decision. The room held its breath, but no one spoke. For the first time in his life, Elias felt as if he had truly earned his place in this galaxy, not by overthrowing the powerful or by making grand speeches, but by choosing to listen, choosing to wait for the right moment. The Queen, in her quiet wisdom, turned toward the delegates. "This man," she said, her voice carrying across the chamber, "has shown us that true power is not in what we can take, but in what we choose to leave behind. The key will not open until the time is right. And that time, I believe, is closer than we think." Elias stood in the center of the hall, the meridian key still in his hand, the weight of history pressing down on him. But in that moment, he understood. His quiet reign had begun not through force, but through the simple act of holding the key until the time was truly right. The delegates filed out of the hall, their voices hushed, their eyes now filled with something different. Respect, not for the power Elias held, but for the way he had chosen to wield it. And as the Queen's silhouette disappeared into the shadows, Elias remained standing in the middle of the chamber, a quiet guardian of the future, a janitor who had never been invisible, but who had always known the power of a clean slate.